So it's my honor to welcome you to the presentation from Mia Khalifa to Bousbir with Nashwa Lina Khan as part of the exhibition Dot by Dot Like a Baby Gazelle, curated by Mitra Fakhrashrafi at La Centrale in Montreal until April 7. So I'm Julia, I use the pronoun she, and I work at La Centrale as coordinator, communication, archive, and public programming. So La Centrale Gallery House is an artist run center dedicated to the dissemination and development of multidisciplinary feminist practices. It is an artist-run center committed to supporting practices and artists that are not very visible in the dominant cultural institutions. And we are also committed to supporting artists at different stages of their careers. We develop programming that engages with feminism and supports intersectionality and social justice. So if you don't already do that, you can follow La Centrale on social media to learn more about us. And I will put some links in the chat if you want to see that. But before going any further, I would like to acknowledge that La Centrale Gallery Powerhouse, as well as myself and most of the participants in this event, are located on indigenous lands, Jojage, which has never been ceded. We also recognize that the Ganangagain Nation as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we are today. We respect the continued connection with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples in the Montreal community. So since this event is online, we also acknowledge that, that other participants may be on different territory, and we invite you to offer your own land acknowledgements now if you want. Oh, I don't see anyone unmuting, so I'm gonna keep going. So the digital technology on which we depend to come together today are complicit in the destruction of the land and deepen the injustices brought about by the cultural white supremacy in which we live. So we are meeting today online, and we are aware that this is a privilege that is not available to everyone. And if you need special assistance, let me know, or my coworker Mattia here, in the chat by writing us messages. And we also want to say that we want this talk to be as safe as possible. So we do not tolerate inappropriate comments, and we reserve the right to exclude any person whose behavior is deemed problematic by La Centrale, the speaker, or by another participant. Okay, so for better sound quality, your sound will be off during the presentation, but you will be able to unmute yourself during the Q&A at the end of the presentation, and you will also be able to ask questions in the chat during the Q&A. And I also want to mention that the conversation is recording and will be available on our website and social media, so just be aware of that when you do an intervention. So thank you for being here. We are really excited to have Nashwa Lina Khan for the presentation entitled From Mia Khalifa to Bousbir, which will explore the theme of hypersexualization, sexuality, and colonism. We would like to do a content warning for the discussion about pornography, nudity, and sex trafficking. So Nashwa Lina Khan is a community educator, facilitator, and researcher. She's also a writer and a poet, and occasionally dabbles in installation and archive that uses narrative methodologies. She holds a Master's of Environmental Studies from York University with areas of concentration focused on narrative methodologies, community and public health, refugee and forced migration studies. Nashwa is now a PhD candidate at York University in environment and urban change. Her work has been published in a variety of places, including Vice, Rewire, This Magazine, and the New York Times. She is the host and producer of 2 podcasts, Muslim Wunsplinga and Habibi Please. So now I will let Nashwa talk and welcome again. And if there is anything, you can talk to me or Mattia in the chat. And I hope you will enjoy this presentation. Thank you.
Okay, it's working now. Amazing. Sorry, it was not working for a second. Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Nashwa Lina Khan, like Julia said, and I want to thank La Centrale and the team there for the exhibition like this. When I first got to chat with Julia and Mitra, who curated the exhibit, I let them know how rare it is to have an exhibit that featured so much work from the Maghreb region, because North Africans have been in Montreal for so long, but there isn't a lot of work around like Amazigh people, or like dedicated spaces where the whole exhibit is dedicated to kind of the art of tattooing and embodiment, but also women, and showing like other narratives of women from the region. And so we witnessed with dot by dot, like a baby gazelle, kind of that identity kind of throughout the ages and throughout time being uncovered, but also like transgressing modern day narratives of Muslim women, like not having tattoos, for example, or not having a history that's beyond Hollywood or fictitious depictions of Muslim women. So it's great to have that space. And then like Mitra is my friend who created the exhibit. We miss our families and we haven't been able to go back home for so long. So having a space like that and being able to see art like that in a dedicated space is nice. And it's letting us kind of engage around the work and feelings and have some ease around community building. And now we can do it virtually too, which is interesting and good, but it'll be very nice to see people in person one day, inshallah. So as Julia said, my name is Nashwa Lina Khan. I'm a community-based researcher and facilitator living on the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit. So that's my own land acknowledgement. And during this talk, we will explore through film, archival image, modern day image, and video, how Muslim women are veiled, unveiled, but also perceptions of Muslim women or the Arab women in writing and kind of through history, and how this all actually originates far beyond Mia Khalifa, but also beyond Bousbir. But the topic kind of anchors itself in those two spaces. So how hypersexualization, sexuality, and colonialism and occupation transcend. And so I think one thing I should mention for sure is kind of how I come to this work. So I did a big project in 2015 where I worked through archival images. My project was on unwed mothers and sex workers in Morocco, and I tried to narrate citizenship and health. And that got me through like this archive of images from this part of Casablanca called Bousbir, which is kind of a hidden part of Moroccan history now, because it was basically an open air sex prison. And it was kind of designed in this neo-colonial Moorish architecture to bring people over to kind of further the French colonial project, but I'll get more into that after. So Orientalism, I think anybody who's here kind of has heard about it. It's kind of a mainstream popularized word now. And for a very long time, scholars have kind of given us this language, taken Edward Said's definition, but it's also mutated as it's traveled. People sometimes actually apply it lazily to too many things, but people post 9/11 tend to call things Orientalism very often, but these scenes kind of emerged in Hollywood very early. So we have this scene from Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark. Terry Richards is in brownface. You have Jonathan Freeman, who was Jafar for the longest time on Broadway for 30 years. Again, another white man in brownface. And so although this conversation is anchored in Bousbir and Mia Khalifa, it's important to contextualize what this kind of ongoing, almost caricature-like cartoonish depictions of Muslims or the Arab other, where it's originated, and kind of like the fabrics they're wearing are black and red, the colors and hues they use, kind of gimmicky, kind of orangey tans, and perhaps moments that are before this, and kind of like beyond what scholars have done, because scholars often focus on kind of how Arab men have been painted as the terrorist or kind of the evil other or kind of the bad guy in these films. And so you also see scenes like this from huge hit, which is Back to the Future. Again, another pre-9/11 example. A lot of contemporary scholars will kind of date from 9/11 onwards, like this is how Arabs have been imagined in cinema, film, portraits, paintings, even like fiction books. But in Back to the Future, nobody's really kind of asking, like, why are there Libyans in Hill Valley, California in 1985? And why do they have plutonium? And why are we talking about nuclear weapons? Everybody's kind of just like, oh, Back to the Future, fun film, Marty McFly, we all love it. So these are questions that perhaps we were not able to ask back then. But it's a revered classic, and social media didn't exist in the same way. So now if something like this tried to come out, there'd be an entire discussion online. You get a lot of diaspora talking about racism, maybe not linking it to kind of the bigger pieces of why this happened. So the deeper connection to be made, however, is that Libya was the first state that the United States declared a terrorist state. And this happened on December 29th, 1979. And the government designated Libya a state sponsor of terrorism, the United States government. And that made Libya and Arabs an arbitrary universal enemy in mid-80s cinema. And so you see like lines like those darn Libyans, those darn Arabs, and again, like white men in brown face. But kind of cinema studies kind of stops at like the analysis of like the Arab man. And then you even see it in like silly things like cartoons, right? So Aladdin, right? So in Aladdin, you're seeing the songs that you show children. Children love this film. It's a great film. I loved it as a child too. But you even have it in like the fun songs where they cut off your ear if they don't like your face. It's barbaric, but hey, it's home. That's kind of a reference at Saudi policy for like stealing bread and like Sharia law, which is like, Sharia law is like the big boogeyman. That, you know, if we let Arabs, like if we don't intervene, if we don't modernize them, if we don't like save their women, save their children, they're going to bring Sharia law. They can cut off noses, faces. That's really only kind of Saudi Arabia. Like where else does Sharia law really exist? And who does it apply to in Saudi Arabia as well? It's not applying to the monarchy. It's not applying to like the top 1% of Saudis. Yeah, this is a cartoon that we love and we show children and we think it's like very normal. And like, what's the perception of the Arab world children are getting? And like, who dresses like this in the Arab world? But again, pre 9/11 cartoon, something people grow up with, don't really question, and it's okay. And so the big thing here to take away is that leaving these caricatures unexamined actually is bad, which we've kind of figured out at this day and age. But also, why has the West crafted this type of storytelling? And why has it just hawked our biggest Hollywood blockbusters? And why is the persistence of this narrative so appealing? And what does this have to do with us and everyday if they're fictional? One of these scenes is the cover from Edward Said's Orientalism, but the bottom one is like one from some of Sacha Baron Cohen's work, because they all evoke types of Arab lands. And Arab land is this mythic location that's never actually existed. It never exists like this. There's no Arab country that actually kind of ever looked like these things that were shown or that are purported, but it does exist in the imagination and it can be conceived to exist, and people will be gullible and believe it exists because that's what they're fed and that's what's been manufactured here and that's what they consume, whether it's like through folklore or postcard series like I will talk about after, or through like cartoons, or through Hollywood movies like Sacha Baron Cohen and what he evokes even as a comedian. So there's like what Jack Shaheen, the late scholar who kind of watched 1,000 Arab films and like films that involved Arabs and said, hey, this is what happens. He called it the Alibaba kit, right? So it's like belly dancer outfits, long pirate-like knives, magic carpets, those genie pants that we all know, and so much more. And leaving these caricatures unexamined, like I said, it's harmful, but it's harmful beyond the whole I got bullied for my school lunch thing. It's harmful because it impacts geopolitics in the real world and also people's intimate encounters in real life, like the racist encounters people see in the streets, but also very much like occupations can be justified by people's popular consciousness around these moments, like Arab land. So there's an urgent need to counter story all of this and to do justice to the diversity of the Arab world, but also kind of counter what Hollywood and Washington, it's like a pipeline, is putting out there. So are these just movies? They're not just movies, and they'll never just be movies, because you can kind of anchor some of the worst moments. So there's some images here to the left to basically huge global conflicts. And why they're all popping up in the global conflicts that have popped up. So you see a lot of the images that come up in Hollywood, it's after kind of the initial Palestinian-Israeli conflict, after the Arab oil embargo, and during the Iranian Revolution and post-Iranian Revolution. And everybody's kind of referred to in vague ways as being Arab or Iranian. Like, you never really know where they're from, or if you know where they're from, it's like a passing moment, but it's just kind of these generalized vague applications of who the Arab is. And they're always kind of like buffoonish, although they're smart enough apparently to pull off a terrorist attack. It always gets foiled by like James Bond-like figure, somebody comes in. And they kind of also always try to show, when they do have a romantic interest, that they're after like typically a blonde white woman. Muslim women are entirely erased. Arab women are entirely erased in all these narratives. And so I've always, like, my curiosity has always been, as a scholar or researcher, okay, we know that Arab men for decades, for 70 years now, have been depicted this way. We know how white women are depicted in reference to Arab men, and we know how white men are depicted in reference to Arab men. But how are Muslim women or Arab women depicted in reference to the world when they are depicted? So I will get there, but just like to reiterate, so negative stereotypes have real consequences. They deprive their targets of humanity, intimidate, and they shame people into silence, and they do shape public opinion. So polls after a lot of these things happen. So like when US diplomats were held hostage for over a year and people polled on like Hollywood movies, people were always like, yeah, maybe, like it was like 85% of polling in the 90s for cinema that depicted Arabs this way. People were like, yeah, no, it's all justified, like they are crazy. And after 9/11, the sentiment just gets stronger, and you see things like 24 pop up, Homeland, and other movies focused on like kind of the caliphate and what that means. So this is like the very big famous quote that like Mia Khalifa has had in her bio for a long time. So this gets us to one of the cornerstones of this talk. So it's, are you even a brown girl with glasses if you haven't been asked if you're Mia Khalifa? And that's like her big line, because her presence has transcended, basically, she believes, and I do believe she is correct in the sense, every North American kind of brown girl's life, because eventually I think it's unavoidable. Mia Khalifa comes up in conversation, whether that's your intimate life, your friendship life, or just being online. So like as a Canadian, for example, she's made the news multiple times, even though we live in Canada, because she had a stance on the farmers' protests. Jagmeet Singh sent her like food one time. And Jagmeet Singh sent her food, and then Rupi Kaur also sent her like flowers, right? So like it's kind of one of those things where like she's unavoidable, like you can't avoid her. And so although the question is a joke about the sexuality of brown girls, our sexuality has and will always have imprints of Khalifa in the West, even if we imagine them not to. And I imagine everybody here knows who she is, but she's more of a lightning rod, in short, because she's known for wearing hijab in pornographic videos. And I'm choosing not to use images of her because I don't think it's like, I think that's an intentional choice. And I've talked to friends about it. And I think it's because I don't think we need to circulate anymore if we're trying to counter story. Like, we don't need to circulate those images. And I am very intentional with what I curate and what I pick for images when I do archive work as well. But I think what we can do is explore like her rise and when she gained her popularity. So during the rise of Khalifa's porn, what was going on in the world? So here are 3 maps. During her rise in the world, so that was 2014, she became the most widely searched for kind of talent on Pornhub, which is fine. But during 2014, you also see the rise of like caliphate. You see the ending, or like 3 years prior to the ending of the occupation of Iraq, but you also see continued American interest in oil, continued American investment there. You see all these military footprints in the Middle East, and you see her also secure deals with Uber, Papa John's, and people think it's like very normal that like somebody's having sex and only a hijab, which is like not a thing any Muslim woman would do, because you take off your hijab when you enter your home. So there's something that's there that's much deeper. And so people were fascinated, and many still are. And so like the images of Arab men that are vilified and typically traced back to a post 9/11 world now that we saw through Real Bad Arabs, Muslim women can easily trace the mass proliferation of Mia Khalifa's porn and rise in the industry to kind of maybe lewd comments you get if you're like a Western diasporic Muslim woman. So what makes them unique and manufactured, and what's also in a name? So like her name isn't Mia Khalifa, that's not her birth name. And what does Khalifa even mean? So Khalifa Caliphate, you see this Netflix poster, very much also intentional, where you have the unveiling with the face half covered. This poster is only from 2020. Actually, this show hasn't faced much criticism, probably because it's in Sweden, but these things are very normal, like we see with Homeland, that was like an 8-season hit in North America. So Khalifa, Caliphate, Caliphate means like the Islamic State, and a Khalifa is like one of the prophets after Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So obviously it's an intentional choice and it's offensive to the Muslim community, because why would somebody in porn who's not Muslim, who's a Christian Lebanese person, whose dad was part of the far right fascist movement in Lebanon, who's very proud of that, be part of like the Muslim community, let alone the leader of it? There's an intentional choice there, and there's an intentional choice to be subversive in that naming, and to choose hijabs that are worn a certain way, which has been noted by a few, but the connections are not really made. But yeah, ISIS and the Caliphate was rising at the same time. And so similar to the way Hollywood's images of Arabs, past and present, existed, Khalifa's images will exist. And now there's a whole genre of porn based on hijab porn that Khalifa started, that a lot of Muslims don't actually, the actresses are not really Muslim or like have any Muslim history, but it's specifically linked to kind of future endeavors of the American empire and conquest, and like is a continued future of what wartime sexual violence used to be, but now with digital technologies. So we're at the tail end and remnants of the occupation of Iraq, 2003 to 2011. And then there was the ongoing occupation and invasion of Afghanistan from 2001. So we see this, Mia Khalifa's porn and popularity is rising, and this genre of porn is proliferating, and people are into it because it's another way, I think, to civilize Muslims and have like women, which are a big part of war, and have Muslim women, but at the same time, take them away from like those disgusting brown men that we talked about earlier, right? So this goes way before this, and that's kind of my big thing with the talk, that many people trace it back to Khalifa, but I'd like to trace it back to so much more. So these accounts of sex from the Arab world, which the porn is trying to emulate, actually existed much before, which I don't think anybody will be surprised from who comes to this talk. So in 1849, one of the first like French explorers, he wrote about in Egypt how the bronze bodies, they have shaped khans, as you can see in this archival kind of book piece, the large brown eyes, the ease with which Arab and Muslim women will have sex with you, and like kind of the ripples in brown bodies. And like these are from his like travel diaries and how European women are not like this. And so you kind of see that in the kind of the dialogue and discourse in some of the scripts that Mia Khalifa speaks from. Name choices. When you have a name like Sarah Jo, why are you going by Mia Khalifa? You're not a successor to like a Muslim state, but you're continuing kind of this longer kind of fascination that these archivists or explorers had in North Africa, Morocco specifically, and Egypt and Algeria. So in simple terms, the name and choice to wear only a hijab in pornography is done to undergird the much larger political project of colonialism, dispossession, and occupation that we see here in this old travel diary, and that we kind of see and can trace back to before Khalifa to places like Bousbir, which is one of many places that existed. And so before Khalifa, you had like the Orientalist artists that Said and others have talked about that evoked images of exotic beauty, sensuality, wealth, and kind of had the wives and children like have their intimate lives in these kind of little quarters or like courtyards that are inside the houses that nobody else could access, apparently except for these painters, right? Who painted those kind of Orientalist portraitures that existed and proliferated. And so that's what people wanted to go see. And so the accounts of sex from the Arab world before Khalifa served a few goals beyond occupation and subjugation. they served to satiate a white man's desire for pleasure, because they had skewed how Arab women are perceived back then and are perceived now. So after the invasion, you have this genre of porn, but if we go way, way back, you can see that this all existed before, and kind of what would be considered, I guess, sex tourism by Western scholars. But if you ever talk to anybody in Morocco, like, this is like very shameful chapter in Moroccan history, and a very sad chapter in Moroccan history. And this area now is kind of just like known as like a bad area when you translate that in Arabic. And there's like a lot of trauma there that people haven't unpacked, but you can see in this one map what the quarter looked like. So Bousbir was this like quarter that was designed after a syphilis outbreak by French colonists, and there were postcards that were sent and circulated throughout Europe to kind of bring people in. And I have this quote from Kathy Carth, because I think that's like kind of multi-generational, where like my generation of Moroccan women now are okay and comfortable talking more about that history, but our moms, our grandmothers, our aunts still have problems talking about it, and like some in our generation do too, because they view it as like deviant or like bad because we're raised Muslim, but at the same time, like, they know that it was a result of French colonialism and occupation. So here you have one of the postcards sent from here, and you see the region was like, has 4 women, because the Bousbir was divided into kind of sectors based on your own like ethnic identity. So if you were Amazi, which is like the indigenous population in Morocco, if you were like Arab, there were like some European sex workers who lived within there, but they had the option to not live within there. And they didn't need permission to leave. And permission is like a very weird word to use in this situation. So there's like a much deeper talk, or much deeper problem here. So women were brought from all over Morocco to this place where colonial doctors checked them for sexually transmitted infections, very heavily surveilled, so that the French soldiers would stop getting syphilis essentially while they were in Morocco building New France. And so Moroccan women don't really identify that as what happened. And so it's like a very different counter history for Moroccans. Okay, sorry, I'm gonna play a short video right now. So that's just like a little clip of some of the archive footage. There's some that's been getting dug up, especially within the last year, and circulated publicly, or else a lot of the postcards, for example, were privately owned and scanned by a few French academics in recent history. Or if you go to Morocco and you like really dig through your family networks, you can find a few things, but the footage is very rare. This is like the only clip that I could like, I think, play ethically. But it existed in full functionality, I would say, from 1924 to 1955. The average age of women who lived there was 21. The youngest allowed to live and work there was 12. And you can briefly kind of see the neo-colonial Moorish architecture in here. And so in 1924, during the expansion, they kind of built this new walled district south of Habous. And Habous in Casablanca is like this place where so many go to today to do tourist shopping, buy leathers, buy like little beaded necklaces, all of those things. It's a shopping destination, and people kind of don't even realize this kind of history that existed right there. And it's named after the French diplomat who owned the land. It's like the Moroccan pronunciation of his name. And so the walls were like 30 feet high. There were 450 to like 675 sex workers in there at a time. There was a single entrance. It was police controlled. And sex workers, people will admit, were coerced by colonial authorities. And like in Morocco, people wouldn't call them sex workers. I would say that's more of a Western thing out of respect, but the women there weren't always making like active choices the way women here might or might not. And so there are like community accounts in Morocco of young women being dragged or told there would be ramifications if they didn't work out of there or their families didn't go. And so here are some archival photos I'll walk through a little bit, but as you can see, some accounts were that it was like a peaceful and refined red light district. But anything's peaceful and refined when you're like forced in this way, but it's just very interesting how it was like a hidden history, but also how these postcards were used in a way that's kind of perverse compared to what you think of a postcard and its use. It's like, right? Like usually it'll be a landscape and it'll be like, come visit Maui or something like that. But these were very intentional postcards that were like, look at Bousbir. Bousbir also had a movie theater. And so it was kind of what Edward Said would have called like a sex tourism Epcot, meant to reflect European fantasies about the East, complete with sexually available women for European men. And that's what these postcards did. And so you can even see that some of the posing in the postcards had mirrored posing to what Orientalist paintings looked like way before this. And Foucault, who also went to North Africa for his own perverse pleasures, made a good point that brothels and colonies here are two extreme types of heterotopia. That wasn't, his here was not about Morocco or Algeria, but his here makes sense when applied to Morocco or Algeria. So what Bousbir presented is what many may consider a transient heterosexuality for men who encountered and entered the space. They could have frequent sexual encounters with many successive partners. It was a landscape of desire, and as a result, it had qualities that were kind of touristy, like a movie theater, which was very rare back then. Architecture that made it a holiday-like space for Europeans. So you see this architecture over here. Not all of Casablanca looked like this at the time, but there was like some exaggerated arcs and kind of picturesque arches that existed. And it allowed French men to escape notions of family that they had at home and domesticity, while ruining kind of the intergenerational lives of Moroccan women. Because in Morocco, even now, like unwed motherhood, which often happens in situations like this, or sex work, are very much contested, and you experience social death when that happens, actually. So it ruins your kid's life as well, because for the longest time, the kids of these women, many of them ended up being unwed mothers, or couldn't find like permanent partners. Their birth certificates for a while said bastard, and then they said X, and so their kids couldn't enroll in the school system. So it's an intergenerational issue. So in Morocco, the status of women who once worked in Bousbir and for years after lingers and is demarcated by this type of social death. And so postcards of the women who lived in Bousbir were sent throughout Europe, but it's not only the postcards of the women who lived in Bousbir. There's other Orientalist photos that took place during that time, including some of the photos I've used today that describe pretty Moorish women. And so it was to display this arabesque playground where women, sometimes bearing facial tattoos, sometimes not, and bare breasts, who would most likely not even show their chest area in public, had their images sent to strangers to entice them to occupy the nation. And women were often displayed and posed wearing traditional jewelry like Amazigh jewelry and headwear. And it's kind of ironic because like the tattooing and the jewelry usually could tell you where you're from. And like the kind of folklore that's passed on is like my great grandma had tattoos. It was like, so if a French person were to kidnap you, they could figure out where you were from or which community you were from or who your people were. Yet these were like kind of adorned and like really loved pieces to be worn and shown in these photos. So now as Bousbir gets attention, it kind of brings us back to like Khalifa, and makes us wonder what the fascination of women from this region is and why the perverse occupation has framed and reframed time and time again how hypersexualized and also desexualized the role of Arab women is, and made us kind of reconfigure what this means when looking at Maghreb and how occupation skews the sexuality and experiences women encounter. And kind of some of the women who were kept in Bousbir were also Algerian. So Algeria kind of had this issue, well, had it very violently happening at the same time. So I've covered the women here, but you can see with the soldiers, you can see the unveiling and the fascination with unveiling and this poster from 1958. This quote is pretty important about how history knows of no other society in which women have been photographed and displayed on such scale to be delivered to public view. So Melek Alula said this, and she's right. Like, it's just a very weird kind of fascination, and there's hundreds of photos like this, and it makes no sense if you're covering your head to be naked in another part of your body. There's a picture here with a hookah, and in Algeria, the hookah wasn't really used back then. So these photos are very much used for no relevance except for the photographer wanting to evoke a certain emotion when people saw these photos. So they're constructed images and forced encounters, and they're kind of the first time and like the first encounters that Europeans get to have with Muslim women at the time. So colonial photographers constructed with a clear intent to both objectify and eroticize their subjects, they offer Europe this first encounter with deliberate staging of the photographs. And it's not deliberately staging lighting, right? It's like putting a hookah in Algeria at a time when that wasn't a thing. It's unveiling breasts, but keeping a headdress on. It makes no sense. And the unveiling fascination. For time's sake, I'm gonna get to Abu Ghraib really quickly, but there was also women who were forced to unveil throughout photos that are like very much revered in European society as like art, but it was just a fascination with the setup. But this all changes when you look at kind of occupation. So circling back to Khalifa and the role of women, one thing that's kind of always missed is that when Abu Ghraib happened, who was holding leashes, who was there? This is like kind of an artistic rendering of just taking the photos of American soldiers who were there, who were women, and kind of honoring the fact that those men didn't want those photos taken, but showing how much they're smiling and kind of these men were emaciated while they were doing this and the women were smiling. So it's to kind of push back on this like Western feminist notion that women are never accomplices and they're always allies, because they're not, but also during the occupation in Morocco and Algeria, French women did also play a role in kind of pushing back and flipping on its head this American feminist conceptualization of what sexualized violence looks like in wartime, especially for the Muslim and Arab world. And you also see this when you see Carolyn Maloney, and you even see the fictitious Claire Danes in Homeland, where you have a scene where she has sex with somebody who's entrapped, but it's never framed as rape, although it was clearly rape because of the power dynamics, which Afro-pessimist scholar Frank Wilderson has used as an example many, many times. And so circling back to Mia Khalifa and how the postcards became porn in modern day, in Pornland, Carol Deans argues that the abundance of pornography and ease of its accessibility has resulted in desensitization to violence and barbarous acts. So Muslim women, like I said, don't wear hijab during sex, and yet in the postcards and Mia Khalifa's porn, and now this new genre that's emerged of occupation porn, as I'd want to call it, some of my friends, for some reason, hijab is kept on during sex. And one of the virtues of wearing hijab as a young Muslim woman, you know, is that it's between you and God, but also it's something you just take off at home. So the scarf on the head serves one purpose, and it's to explicate the Muslimness of the woman in the video. So it's not Muslim porn, and that's a bad way to describe it, as many do. It's not catered to Muslims, and it doesn't honor Muslim women in any way, and that argument's really defamatory. What it is circulated to kind of entice previously a European fantasy, but now an American fantasy, in which the agency of Muslims is always taken away. The Muslim woman has no voice or real identity. She just symbolizes something to be conquered, and is likely unsatisfied until met by a white man, and the brown man must accept that the white man taking the Muslim woman for himself is happening, and that's a true conquering. So there's a problem here, and even though it's twofold, and although at this stage I can't offer a perfect solution nor promise one, I think that there are invaluable distinctions that we can make, and I think we can move away from enhancing the juggernaut of speaking to and centering white thinking. So often kind of being defensive or like speaking to like things like Carolyn Maloney, people become obsessed with speaking to that instead of providing our own narratives. So most recently with like kind of the headlines about being uncivilized, you see like people spend 3 days on like making t-shirts or like being like, I'm civilized, look at this photo of me, when that's really not what we need to be doing. So I'm just gonna show one video I really like that shows Muslim and Arab women really kind of taking back our bodies and our embodiment and our experiences of kind of sex and liberation.
أنا البنت اللي قصتها ممنوعة من العرض. أنا البنت اللي صرختها مقموعة ما تدقوا بالعرض. جسدك بيعيش بالطول وبالعرض، بيسبيح جسدي بالإكراه وبالفرض. عرضي منه جسدي منه شرفك بشرفك. عايشة بمجتمع سيادة الشنب، أرجوك احترم عقلي، حط جسدي عجنب. عرضي مش منشور، موزع بمنشور، لما بدك توصمو بالفجور. عرضي منه جسدي منه شرفك بشرفك. عرضي نقطة دم ناطرينا بالدخلة، بهالنقطة بيصير الكل إله دخلة. يا أما بترشوني بمسك الطهارة، يا أما بترشوني برصاص وحجارة. عرضي منه جسدي بشرفك، جسدي منه شرفك.
أنا أنتي، أنا آلاف الثائرات، جئت أغني، صوتي أسكت العادات عنك وعني. هل تسمعون الصرخات؟ أنا وأنتي ندعو للحياة. أنا أنتي، أنا آلاف الثائرات، جئت أغني، صوتي أسكت العادات عنك وعني. هل تسمعون الصرخات؟ أنا وأنتي ندعو للحياة.
أنا الزوجة، أنا الأخت، أنا الأم، أنا البنت.
أنا البنت المختصة بجسدها وحقوقها. أنا مواطن فئة تانية ما بتصدقوها. أنا الناجية اللي قاعدين تعاقبوها. عرضي منه جسدي منه شرفك. أنا الأبسط حقوقها رافضين تشرعوها. كل صرخات الشوارع ما بتسمعوها. جاي اليوم سمع صوتي وهبط الحيطان. جاي أنا قود الثورة، اشهدي يا جدران. أنا أنتي، أنا آلاف الثائرات، جئت أغني، صوتي كتم العادات عنك وعني. هل تسمعون الصرخات؟ أنا وأنتي ندعو للحياة. أنا أنتي، أنا آلاف الثائرات، جئت أغني، صوتي كتم العادات عنك وعني. هل تسمعون الصرخات؟ أنا وأنتي ندعو للحياة.
So this video focuses on honor, which in Moroccan Arabic is hashuma, which was like a big part of my master's work as well. So hashuma is like the word that's automatically said when people want to talk about Bousbir in Morocco, like if you're with aunts or like other women, or you're even at a hair salon, whatever, doing everyday things. Bousbir just has like still that kind of knee-jerk reaction of hashuma, or like what happened, there's hashuma. So you see kind of organizations like this. So even though this is not in Morocco, this video made waves in Morocco with the feminist community and organizing community in Morocco, talking about honor and like kind of women are multidimensional, but it's also not like a bad chapter in our lives and not our fault that this chapter happened. And even if things like that happen, like there's ways forward, right? And so it's nice to kind of counter story and not focus on the fact that Moroccan or Arab women are like one-dimensional and can only be this binary of Black bundles seen in cinema where they're covered, the way Representative Maloney or Homeland, that poster did, or the way the French kind of colonists in Algeria kept saying unveil. Muslim women are so much more and Arab women are so much more. And I'm going to play one more video and then we can wrap up and do some questions.
في شوارعنا اللبنانية العربية ونظامنا الأبوي المرأة تسمى بالبقلاوة، والبقلاوة هي نوع حلو عربي يصنع من رقائق العجين، الزبدة، السكر، الجوز، اللوز وقصص. كيف يحدث الأمر؟ تمر الفتاة أم البنت أم المرأة، لأنه في فرق بيناتهم، بجانب السيارة التي يقودها شاب فيقول لها
إيه شو؟ البقلاوة صار لها إجيان وبتمشي؟
بلا طول سيرة.
البقلاوة التي تتحدث عنها والتي تحلي حياتك تخاف منك ليلا نهارا صباحا مساء مشيا في شارع الحي أم مدخل البناية لأنك خطر.
البقلاوة التي تتحدث عنها والتي تحبك تتفاداك مطبخا، صالونا، حماما، سريرا لأنك خطر.
مين طلعك من المدرسة؟
خطيبي. البقلاوة التي تتحدث عنها والتي هي كل حياتك تتفاداك أحاديثا مشاريعا مشاهدة مسلسلات تركية لأنك الخطر.
أي أقسى كلمة قلت لها إياها اليوم تندم عليها؟
أنا البقلاوة التي تتحدث عنها أعطيك وأعطيك وماذا تفعل؟ تأخذ حتى بالقوة.
أحميك بجسمي
وماذا تفعل؟ بتفتش على جسمي. خلصك بروحي من خيالك. وماذا تفعل؟ لحقني مثل خيالي. البقلاوة التي تتحدث عنها هي أكلك، قهوتك، صوتك، فيروزك، صباحك، عيدك، إيمانك، أمنك، آمانك، أمك، قلبك. فماذا تفعل؟
ما بدي منك شيء ولا شيء، بدي بس أعطيك تشوفني، تقشعني، تحس، تبدلني. أنا صانعة أمان، فماذا تفعل؟
So this video shows like the Safe Keepers movement, and you see like that reference to the little girl being pulled out of school because she got engaged at 12 years old. So it's to kind of show and proliferate a narrative of one, Arab women are taking agencies, they're safe keepers for each other, and they're fighting for rights, and whether it's sexual rights or civil rights. And there's the big argument by Shireen Al-Fiqi and myself where it's like your bedroom rights do reflect your civic rights in society. So you see all these groups from Arab women's civil society rising up to kind of push back and have this movement of safe keepers, which is kind of the English word that we would like to use for this. So counter-storying to me is more important than kind of fixating on what the West would do. And then my last thing is the reason we should do this is because of like what the ineffable Toni Morrison said, which is the function of racism is to distract us, right? So there's projects being built and Muslim and Arab women are kind of reclaiming and building our own things. And we know what we want and what we don't want. And so I hope that people come away with today with knowledge that the sexualization and hypersexualization of the Arab world and Arab women will always be pocked and embedded with remnants of occupation, and media consumption matters, and critical media consumption matters, because there are much larger political ramifications here. So thank you again, Julia, and the other staff and Mitra. I've felt so much warmth, and there's a clear vision for Dot by Dot Like a Baby Gazelle. So if you're in Montreal, I highly recommend you go to it. And you can stay in touch. Here's my public Twitter account, and here's my email. And I will pass it off to Julia to moderate the questions.
Thank you so much, Nashwa. I don't know, can you still hear me and see me? Okay, great, thank you. So thank you so much, Nashwa. This was a really rich and interesting and necessary presentation. So I want to thank you, and I also really like how that was like in related to the exhibition in a really interesting way, I think. So thank you for that. So now we're gonna open the discussion for questions. So you can ask questions in the chat, or you can also unmute yourself and ask your question. So if someone is already speaking, please raise your hand, and then you will be able to ask your question just after that. And we can also take questions in French if you prefer, and I will do my best to do the translation. So now it's time for questions. Thank you. So if no, I don't know if someone wants to ask something. I have a question in relation to the exhibition. So I don't know if you want to ask a question about that, or maybe we can wait a little bit more.
I just got a message from somebody. If you want to unmute Alice, you can ask, or you can type it. Hi, I can't hear you that well, sorry.
Okay, I'll speak up.
Okay, I can hear you better.
Yeah, so sorry, I missed the first bit, so I just saw the video with the baklava, and but they're safekeepers, and so I missed the introduction, so I apologize if I have to repeat. But so the safekeepers is sort of what this group of women want to represent themselves as. But the baklava is sort of a gendered slur.
So the way baklava is used in like Lebanon, if you're walking on the street, or like Morocco, there's variations of it. It's just like, I would say analogous to in English, if somebody calls you like sweetie or something, but like in a catcalling way. Or else baklava is something we eat, but it's like the tone with which like, so baklava got legs is like, it's like the same as catcalling here. So they're trying to reclaim it here and like unpacking like the multidimensional lives of like what this baklava goes through. Like an Arab woman that you're catcalling is like this more complicated person, but also like reclaiming it almost with those scenes of Arab women kind of in arts or doing other things, and nuancing the conversation that like none of us are saying our lives are great in our countries either, but we're able to counter-story them, and we don't really need the West counter-storying them or like intervening at all, and they're much more complicated, just like every other woman's life is everywhere they live. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And I haven't seen the show. I was going to go on Saturday, which is, yes, thankfully tomorrow.
Oh, yeah, it's a beautiful show.
And I was just wondering, maybe you could preview and say how it's related. Why are you thinking of this video in relation to your work?
The video or the exhibition, I would say, and actually the curator is a good friend of mine, and on here, I think they're all in we're all in conversation about like embodied experiences and kind of the body from the Middle East or North Africa, and like the different ways we either use our bodies or present our bodies or reclaim our bodies, yeah, and navigating the world. So you'll see when you see the exhibit, they're definitely touching on other things, but we're all in conversation, I would say.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you, Alice, and I hope you enjoy the exhibit.
I'm sure welcome.
Thank you, Alice, for your question. We have another question in the chat. I can read it. So thank you so much for your presentation. I just wanted to ask if you had any example of show or movie that humanize Muslim women set in the West. Is there even such a thing?
Yeah, this is a great question. I would like look to the Arab world for film first. And actually this person I know knows this film, but Caramel by Nadine Lebeki, I would say does that. But in the West, I think Rami has attempted it, but I've been a critic of Rami and Rami's portrayal of Muslim women. And after the first season, actually a lot of critical of Rami season 1, Muslim women were hired to write season 2, but the way the way his writing and that show treats like Muslim women who practice is still like a big issue, but it does show Muslim women as more dynamic and like being sexual agents or just agents of their own bodies and autonomy in the West past a certain point, but it still has its own issues, like where Rami refuses to like sleep with a Muslim woman because she's Muslim, but he will sleep with a non-Muslim woman, a Jewish or a Christian woman, and that just adds to this kind of binary of either you're virginal or married as a Muslim woman, which is a whole nother talk on kind of media and cinema studies and what happens. So in short, unfortunately, I don't think I know of something. Actually, maybe England Lady Parts, which this person I know might also know, but I think that's what's doing the best right now for Muslim women in the West.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I don't see other questions in chats. Someone wants to unmute. I don't know the question in the chat. Okay, so maybe I'm just gonna ask a question I have for you, but it's a question that I can say in relationship to the exhibition. So I just was wondering if you saw like a link in the way you use the archive in your work, and how the artists from the dot by dot, like a baby gazelle exhibition, use archive or personal archives in their work. Like, do you, I don't know if you think about that when you saw the show.
Yeah, I think, for example, like Iman's work where her grandfather, so Iman's grandfather is from Morocco as well. So I think transposing like new Amazigh tattoos onto her grandfather is something I try to do with archive photos, because like I mentioned briefly that I try to think through what's acceptable to show and not show, but I also, if I want to show a photo and I alter it, I try to think through like what's a way to alter that honors or evokes a different history or add something. So she took these photos of her grandfather that are postcards that if you go to the show, you'll see circulating, and she kind of transposed Amazigh tattoos onto him and reimagined that. So I think I kind of try to think through that as well. So that's a very good question. And I think also kind of contextualizing pieces in a bigger history and not just like letting them lay flat. So we see that with the video that's in the gallery as well. I have a question that got sent to me that I can read, Julia. So as an art historian, I always need to be concerned with categories. Do you or other artists, curator, associate with this term, sorry. So I always need to be concerned with categories. Do you or other artists, curators associate with this term Middle East and North Africa, Southwest Asia and North Africa? So this is a tough one, the Mina Swana thing. It's actually super tough because I try to complicate it because I'm Amazigh as well, and like Amazigh people don't always fit into Mina Swana or feel like flattened by that. And I'm also very concerned with categories and kind of turning something flat because you categorize it, or accidentally reinforcing a binary, or reinforcing for some to be included into a nation. For example, you exclude people automatically. So I am also very, very, very concerned with it. But people who are from the Middle East and North Africa still right now, like when I've been in conversation with people, don't really identify with Swana. So why am I going to use a language that like academia here, it's kind of like Latinx. When you talk to people from the region, they're like, what does this mean? Like sometimes academia creates something that like the people don't even identify with. And I think we need to be cognizant of that and honor that and be fair about it. So like I have a hard time with that, or else like whenever I fall into that with like the Swana thing, if I talk to a archivist or artist in Morocco who's not European or North American trained, they're like, what does this mean? Like, they're like, what is Swana? Like, I'm Moroccan, I'm Maghrebi or something. So I try to be very careful about it. And I sometimes in like talks too, you end up flattening things, but I try to always be like, this is part of a bigger thing or part of a moment or a moment of that. But I appreciate this question because I think as like, whatever we are, like a historian, an archivist, an artist, a writer, you have to be thoughtful about these things. So thank you so much, Alice.
Thank you. Do we have other questions? Nashwa, if you want to add something, you can also take this time to add something if you want.
Okay. The only thing I'd like to add is that like I hope people complicate more like images that they see when they think of like the Orient or Orientalist painting, like to think about like the lives of people that actually happen when it comes to photography, because sure, Orientalist painting is fake and maybe a figmentation and had further goals, but like these pictures had like really big issues with them that didn't get to get taken up, and that people are still finding some of these and scanning them or uploading them because there are just so many of them that circulated, and at different moments, right? They're not all from Bousbir at all, and it's just that was just like a popular type of photography, and that people can also think of them as like what predated Mia Khalifa as like a type of kind of risque quote unquote photo, and like what the veil actually does is just like explicate Muslimness or Arabness and like how that actually relates to occupation, because that doesn't really happen, and just saying things are Orientalist is a flat way to do that.
I have a thank you, Nashwa, for saying that. Thank you. It was really, really interesting. I had a question in the chat that was written to me, so I'm gonna read it. Is that okay?
Yeah, of course.
Can we have your thought on the book Sex, Race et Colonie that was published in France 3 years ago about this? I don't know if you know about this book, but
Sex and what?
Race and Colonies, but the title is in French. So Sex,
I don't know.
Race et Colonie.
I don't know this book, but I appreciate the question, and I will look into this book. I don't know this book. I hope there's an English translation.
Yeah, that was my next question. I don't know if there is an English translation.
I guess I have a question regarding that. I'm also really interested in the depictions of Muslim and Arab and South Asian women, and I was wondering if you had any recommendations for readings that would be like good for that.
Yeah, like I have this book here, which is called Sex and the Citadel, Intimate Life in a Changing Arab World. I would say it touches a bit on like the Muslim aspect, because inevitably all of the Arab world has Muslims. For South Asian, that's like a little harder. I would look at Yasmin Nair's writing. She's done a bit of writing actually that's really good on Pakistan on her blog, and women, she called them the dancing girls, I think. It's really good. I really would look at Yasmin Nair's work. The way she complicates it is good. I don't want to plug my own podcast, but I did an episode with her on it. Okay. Because I think a lot about South Asia as well. And like kind of, yeah, exactly. I'm thinking about the same things. So it's nice to meet you this way virtually, but those are two, like Yasmin is somebody I would definitely look at for South Asia. And then for Muslim women, I think Shireen Al-Fiqi does an okay job. It's like a little bit of an old book now, but it's like it's one of the only ones that talks about like kind of the bedroom lives of Arab women, and the way that it does if you don't read Arabic, because it's in English. But yeah, I would say there's a lot of gaps still, and a lot of it's like kind of informal. Like you'll find stuff informally, or you'll find like academics. And the problem I found with academics, especially like French academics who go to Morocco, is that they're not always getting kind of certain words translated correctly or accurately. So I found some issues in translation sometimes, but Yasmin, I think, does a good and fair job. Forgetting the exact name of the articles, but something about it says Dancing Girls.
Okay. And which of your podcasts did you do an episode?
I interviewed her on Habibti, Please.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you. Oh, so I think there is a question in the chat. Oh, actually, it's a question for me, I think. I'm gonna read it out loud. So La Centrale is a really important space in Montreal as the oldest feminist artist run center in Canada. Would you like to speak about would you like to speak to what feminism, perhaps most specifically non-white feminism, means in Morocco? It was not a question for me, actually. I did not read in until the end, I'm sorry. Did you understand that, Nashwa?
So what non-white feminism means in Morocco?
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, I think in Morocco, like what it means, like I look at reproductive health and justice, and that includes sexual justice and sexual like bedroom rights is what myself and some other women call it. So in Morocco, non-white feminism looks like understanding when a woman like wants something, like she wants her quote unquote honor intact. So like I work a lot with unwed mothers in Morocco who become non-citizens or rendered non-citizens, and like they will make choices or have views that like maybe somebody who grows up with a Western feminist framework doesn't necessarily understand or like would want to fight or transgress against. So like I worked at one place called ASF, which is one of the biggest feminist organizations in Morocco for unwed mothers. And the big issue they have is when people do internships there from diasporic communities, especially like Australia, England, Canada, America, sometimes they don't understand the women wanting to like get married to somebody who is so bad to them, but they want to get married so their children can have a legal document, a birth certificate that makes their child a valid citizen again and can get like a citizen card again. They're not asking to get married because they believe in like patriarchy and these systems and things like that. So a non-white feminism in Morocco is like the feminism that exists that's complicated and nuanced by culture and religion. And it doesn't mean they're going to live with that husband. And that's something that people need to know. They're just going to do that paper so that their child has a future. And they're not going to kind of take our approach here where your child doesn't really need a father and can register in school. It's just a very different world like understanding. Or they're going to do something like that to reconcile with their moms because their mom stopped talking to them and their mom is so important in their life. They're going to find ways to do things that might not make sense in like kind of a feminist world where we have so many different choices, but our upbringings are different and our realities are so different. So I think it's also about like counterstorying, like not everybody there like wants to go to school and have a job the way that we might want to, but not everybody here wants to either. But also like in Morocco, like the rights that they're asking for can be different and are different, but like women have the same dreams everywhere, I think, which is like autonomy, to be happy, to like have full civic rights. The feminist movement there, I would say also when I say reproductive health and justice, there's like more of a two-tier med system, and that includes like there's problems with like having childbirth in a good way there. And I think that's like one of the big feminist asks right now is like meaningful work, like recognition because we have citizenship cards there. And then like recognition as a full citizen and having your children become full citizens, regardless of your like socioeconomic status or marital status. And then like the ability to get like safe reproductive health care still, even though over there, like for example, there's like condom vending machines outside. So like it's weird because there's these things that I don't think we would ever have here that they have there. And they're like, you guys don't have this thing there? Like we have access, they have better access to like condoms than we have here, in my opinion, in some cities. But of like the things like getting a gynecologist check there is a feminist ask they have there, because if you're unmarried and you want to get a pap smear, you can't over there.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this question, and thank you for your answer, Nashwa. I think it's really interesting to have the perspective that you just talked about, and also with all your talk and your research. It's really, really great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Nashwa. It's really interesting to hear you and to think about the show in the same time. It's really, really great. Thank you.